The Internet has experienced more than a few updates since 1996, but the same can't be said for Internet regulations. 2021 is the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the last comprehensive update to Internet regulation. Since then, the Internet's evolution has created endless possibilities and new challenges too. Facebook supports updated regulations that set clear guidelines on today's toughest challenges, including protecting people's privacy, fighting misinformation, reforming Section 230, and more. But Facebook isn't waiting for regulation. They're continuing to take action to improve and secure its platforms, building new privacy tools, tripling their security and safety teams, and working with tech peers to enable the safe and secure transfer of data between platforms. See Facebook's progress on key issues and what's next at about.fb.com/regulations.
Sunday, August 29th, 2021. I'm Jared Halpern. Americans and Afghans are racing to evacuate before next week's U.S. troop withdrawal.
The Taliban would set up multiple different little checkpoints in between or randomly segregate people and then push them back.
And Democrats stick together to press forward on the president's Build Back Better agenda.
So we got to figure out an amount that we can work with. And of course, I want to know what's in there.
This is the Fox News Rundown from Washington. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is expected to be completed next week, along with the military-led evacuation effort happening at Kabul's airport. Despite that deadline, the president has insisted there is no end to the commitment to get Americans out, along with Afghan partners who want to leave the country.
Will be, I believe, numerous opportunities to continue to provide access for additional persons to get out of Afghanistan, either through means that we provide and or are provided through in cooperation with the Taliban.
Not that the Taliban are good guys, President Biden says, but they do have incentive.
They very much would like to figure out how to keep the airport open. They don't have the capacity to do it. They very much are trying to figure out whether or not they can maintain what is the portion of an economy that has become not robust, but fundamentally different than it had been.
But as we have learned over the last few days with that awful terror attack at Abbey Gate, the journey to escape is proving dangerous and inconsistent with Taliban checkpoints.
Even with their evacuation orders and all of that, that they were pressing through crowds of thousands of people, the Taliban would be shooting to try and address crowd control, and often, allowing them through a checkpoint and then pushing them back to the beginning to have to start over again.
Marie Clark is vice president of Women for Women International, an organization like so many others now desperately trying to get Afghans out of the country while preparing for Taliban rule.
So Women for Women International has been in Afghanistan since 2002, and we have reached over 120,000 women over that period of time, and many thousands of men with our programming. We are run by an entirely Afghan team, have about 88 staff on board at this point, just to give you a sense of the scope. And our programming includes a 12-month course for women that helps them to increase their decision-making power at the household level about things like how many children to have and how to spend the budget of the family, as well as to start small businesses and be trained in a vocation. So we test our impact and the progress of the women in our program around how much more income they are having, how much more savings. We start savings groups, which in very rural areas can become like mini banks that enable women to save and lend to one another. And then because of the context, we also have programming with men that grounds a case for women's rights in Quran. So it's a Quranic argument for women's rights. And after the women have been through their 12-month program and the men have been through their program, the women elect change agents that work on gaining women's rights in the community. And the men elect what they call Community Protection Committee members who support the women in a joint effort to safeguard women's rights in Afghanistan. So that could be anything from getting access to more healthcare for women and girls, or access to education, to changing a cultural practice at the local level.
So the natural question is any of that work now, in your view, going to be able to continue as the Taliban now appears to be in control of much of the country?
Yes. So we obviously at this moment, all of our staff are sheltering in place, those that have not had the opportunity for evacuation. And so we've had to have a pause on programming, although we're still in touch with participants of our program on a really regular basis. We haven't been able to, hold visible trainings with banks and markets closed and everything. Sort of the whole country is trying to shelter in place as we wait to see what happens on the political side. However, we're absolutely committed to remain in Afghanistan and to continue programming with men and women and their families. We work exclusively as an organization with women survivors of war in places of conflict. And so we are finding ways that we can adapt our programming depending on the level of repression that we receive from the Taliban. And our expectation is that might look different district by district, province by province, since the Taliban are not a cohesive, homogeneous group.
I have a lot of questions, but let's start with, because you mentioned that there are members of your organization who have evacuated, trying to evacuate. Can you give me a sense of what that process has been like for these women?
Oh, it's just been such a traumatic and challenging process. We were able to get evacuation orders for some of our most at-risk staff and allies. Our whole organization working for women's rights means that really actually everyone, including all of those change agents and participants of our program, are visibly seen as advocates for women's rights, which puts them at great risk right now. So we were able to receive some opportunities for them to leave, and we have successfully enabled 4 families, a total of 31 people, to have safe passage out of the country. But several additional people who had evacuation orders were not able to make it through the chaos at the airports, the Taliban checkpoints. They just kept being pushed back away from the gate. And we have really horrifying voice audio memos coming in from colleagues as we were supporting them on their journey, describing the scene, even with their evacuation orders and all of that, that they were pressing through crowds of thousands of people. The Taliban would be shooting to try and address crowd control, and often, allowing them through a checkpoint and then pushing them back to the beginning to have to start over again. Some of the survivors of this process that have now safely landed in another country are sending pictures now to me today of their relatives' marks from being beaten by the Taliban. So we have really gotten a chance to have a front seat to the absolute desperation and disorder that has been surrounding the airport and the evacuation points like the Baron Hotel.
When you say evacuation orders, that's through the U.S. State Department, sort of through the SIV program or the P1, P2 protections?
So no, in our case, while we do have staff lists that are being put forward to multiple different governments, it was the UK government that came forward first with an evacuation order.
But these are the types of orders that, the U.S. government at least has said that the Taliban's supposed to let these folks through.
Right. And that is the agreement. And so what we would find is that the Taliban, they had set up multiple different checkpoints. There was a big overarching perimeter, but even then between that perimeter and the gates, whether it was Abbey Gate where the explosion happened, or the Barron Hotel, which was one of the expediting points for evacuation flights, and the gates to that hotel, the Taliban would set up multiple different little checkpoints in between, or randomly segregate people and then push them back. So it really was an incredibly challenging time. And even though the official word was that the Taliban was meant to be able to see the image of the flag on their phone of the country that was evacuating them and the evacuation order, and that would allow them to proceed, we had really mixed results across the women that we were supporting to leave.
What happens to those who have not yet made it through if they're not through after the 31st?
My guess is that actually if they're not through now, that it is very unlikely that they will leave through that airport, and that we will see evacuation flights stop even possibly before the 31st, given the level of threat that exists there now. We're telling those that have failed to make it through to be staying at home, and we hope to find other immigration opportunities for them or other ways to support them, especially for those that have the right now to go and live in a different country. But the situation at the airport is just so dangerous, and especially so dangerous for these really at-risk women's rights defenders. And it's looking very unlikely that they would be able to safely get passage into the airport.
So the primary goal of your organization, at least over the last couple of days, has been getting people out, trying to get people out.
Not only trying to get those that are most at risk out and offer opportunities for all of the staff and participants that seek to leave the country, but also to provide the psychosocial support for those that remain, to coordinate around enabling those that are at risk and have no hope of getting out soon to have access to safe houses, because the Taliban, while we have had very different reception from them in the different provinces and places where we've worked, have explicitly threatened some of our allies or women's rights defenders that we're in relationship with, and they need to be able to find hiding at this point, and if they can't have evacuation. And then I think the recognition is that even if it were to have been a very successful ability to evacuate all of the at-risk human rights defenders and women's rights defenders that we are in touch with, it's very unlikely that all of our staff and all of the participants of our program would be able to find safe harbor somewhere else. And so we are really working also on the psychosocial 911 for those that are feeling abandoned and who are terrified of being identified or retaliated against for the women's rights work that they've done thus far, and preparing our program pivots, because the reality is that it's a completely different context, and it is looking like it could become a humanitarian crisis at the level that we've seen in Yemen. So working with women and survivors in places of conflict, we can already anticipate some of the next crises that are going to hit the news. For example, it's been too dangerous to farm in much of Afghanistan. So we see food prices rising, and we know a hunger crisis is looming. So for Women's pivot on that is not only to keep our demonstration farms going, since agriculture is one of our vocational tracks, but to provide kitchen gardens and poultry to women, because it enables them to have a bit more food sovereignty and less dependent on food aid. But so we're also really busy trying to anticipate the different ways that we can continue work.
I know that there are a lot of people listening to this that have seen the images in horror of what's happening there. What can people who may be hearing this here in the States contribute? Is there anything that your organization needs, that these women in Afghanistan need from just everyday Americans? Absolutely.
So many things. So if you go to womenforwomen.org, there's a How Can I Help button, and that can guide you to a whole list of options, everything from donations, because we will need to be able to mobilize cash to support women and their families, not only with things like the kitchen gardens, but also being able to have access to cell phones that enable us to organize and pivot when and where women meet for their safety, but to keep them in connection with each other, and then to provide this psychosocial 911 that are so desperately needed by women right now. But there's also opportunities to advocate to the Biden administration around what's needed next, opportunities to send messages of solidarity and support. It's when you're a woman that's in hiding right now and terrified, this idea that there's this global community of supporters that has your back and that's going to be present with you and supporting you going forward has an incredible emotional and psychological benefit for women. And we've seen that throughout our history. And I can see that even at play in the texts that are going back and forth between myself and my colleagues in Afghanistan, that here we've been sending them all of this support, finding ways to help them in through this crisis. And when that bombs went off at the airport, the messages came back not only with just grief for everyone's life lost, but grief for us as an American team that's been supporting them for American lives lost. That is real commitment and power of solidarity. And that's what it's going to take for women to be able to survive and thrive under a Taliban regime, that type of global support.
The stories that you've shared are hard even for me to sort of process. There's like just no context, I think, for so many people. And so I really appreciate you sharing those stories with us. The best of luck to you in your organization. I know it's a scary time for so many people, an uncertain time. The best to you and our best to all of your colleagues that are still trying to get safe passage out of Afghanistan. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
2021 is the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the last comprehensive update to Internet regulation. The Internet has experienced more than a few updates since 1996, but Internet regulations have not. That's why Facebook supports updated regulations on key issues like preventing election interference, protecting people's privacy, reforming Section 230, and more. See Facebook's progress on key issues and what's next at about.fb.com/regulations.
It's said you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. The idea, grand plans you have to win office are usually more nuanced, challenging, have more plot twists once you take office. Certainly, that can be said for President Biden and the Democratic majority in Congress trying to make good on a Build Back Better agenda that could require trillions of dollars in new spending. Now, having control of the House, the Senate, and a president all in the same party can make that prose easier to write. Easier, but not easy. Take this week. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi interrupted the August recess, bringing lawmakers back to pass a Senate-approved budget reconciliation resolution, allowing as much as $3.5 trillion for human infrastructure, universal pre-K, expansion of health programs, new investments in climate initiatives, and potentially raising taxes on corporations and top individual earners. Now, the resolution is a framework. No money has yet been authorized, but it is a critical step to moving ahead on a way to approve that spending without worry of a Senate filibuster. Democrats can make it happen without any votes from Republicans. But Democrats will need few, perhaps no, defections among themselves. And thus the plot twist this week. A group of 10 House Democrats threatened to block the budget framework without first voting on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There was a standoff. It lasted several hours, leaving the House in a state of suspension late into the night, before the next day when every single Democrat, including those 10 moderates, voted yes to advance the budget with a provision the infrastructure bill gets voted on next month. So what happens now? Texas Congressman Henry Cuellar was one of those moderate holdouts and explained to me how the deal, for now, came together.
Well, look, what we asked for was two things. One, we wanted to have a vote, a set date to vote on this bipartisan infrastructure bill, which we did get it for September 27th. The second thing is something that I personally requested from when I was part of this group was I said, look, I want to make sure that we don't vote on something that's high and then the Senate votes for something that's lower or might have different provisions. I learned what happened in 2010, to be quite honest with you, where the House voted on certain things and the Senate didn't vote on those things. So I learned that you got to be on the same page. So my request was to the group was make sure that whatever the House votes on, it's got to be on something that the Senate is going to approve, which means we all got to be on the same page to get this job done. So that key part is going to be has been very important. That was one of the things that I requested.
So it sounds like what you're saying is as we move forward now over the next few weeks and House committees and Senate committees start working on what ultimately becomes a reconciliation package, that you want these two committees sort of doing the same thing. You don't want the House producing a product, the Senate producing a product, and then sort of trying to work it all out.
Yeah, I mean, look, we already know the 3.5 is only a framework. I think it says up to 3.5. Do I support a 3.5? Of course I don't. And you got House members, you got Senate members that don't approve that. So we got to figure out an amount that we can work with. And of course, I want to know what's in there, what are the spending parts of it. But I also want to look at the pay fors. You know, how do we pay for this? So there are the paid fors, the revenue part, and of course the part dealing with the spending. And that's something that, you know, we just got to work this process out.
The way that we look at this, should this be based on sort of what a top line figure is, or should it be based on, listen, these are the initiatives and the programs we need to fund, and whatever that total is what that total is? Sort of, is that, how are you approaching these negotiations now over this bigger package?
Well, you know, again, there's going to be a process. There are senators, there are House members, there are progressives, there's moderates like myself. And the same thing on the Senate side. So, you know, we're going to let the process work there and see where we end up with. But I mean, there's some things that people will support, some people that don't support. So we got to understand what the different House members and the Senate members have to say.
Let me talk briefly about that infrastructure package as well, because as you say, the agreement now is a vote on that no later than the 27th of September. One, is that soon enough for you? And two, how bipartisan do you expect that to be in the House?
Well, you know, we hope to get Republicans on board, and I assume there will be Republicans that will support this. You know, there's always a question about the progressives who said, no, we should vote for reconciliation first before we support this. So, yeah, it's going to take a lot of work to make sure we can get Republicans and Democrats on board.
Is September 27th soon enough for infrastructure? I know that's been a priority, not just for you, but for the president, for Republican leaders. This sort of was seen as sort of the first big kind of legislative win here in the domestic agenda.
Well, look, infrastructure is important to Democrats, Republicans, independents. It doesn't matter whether it's roads or broadband or bridges. It's important to all of us, and it's not a political party that somebody dominates when it comes to infrastructure. It's important to all of us. You know, how we get there, of course, there's differences. Progressives have a certain thinking, moderates have a different thinking, and, you know, we need to try to figure out how we get there. But keep in mind that this bill that got passed by the Senate, I believe, doesn't take effect till October 1st. So when we vote on this on the 27th of September, it will go straight to the president's desk for signature.
Let's talk more about this larger reconciliation framework that we had started the conversation with. I know you say $3.5 trillion is too much. I mean, does that mean that there's like sort of a number that you won't go above?
No, look, I don't know where we're going to end up. As you know, I'm only one out of 435 members, and there's 100 senators.
One's a lot when you have a majority of three.
Well, I think we kind of figured that one out just the last couple of days. But again, look, I'm not going to tie myself like some members do to a particular number. You know, I have an idea what I want to look at, but again, it's going to just depend on the legislative process. You know, what the Senate and the House can agree on, because that was my point that I brought up, was that, some people wanted just to vote on it right away. To me, that was important to get a date to vote. But to me, the most important thing, which is what we're talking about, is that we work on a parallel track with the Senate and the House. I do not want the House to vote on something that the Senate is not agree on.
So you want to see those 50 Senate votes before the House takes action?
That was the agreement that we reached, and that we will have to have 50 votes on the Senate, because I don't want to vote on something on the House side that the Senate is not going to approve. That was the agreement, and that was the point that I brought up to the group of 9. And of course, as you know, it grew a little bit more from the 9, but that was it. The focus was first on a date to vote on this. I brought in, I think the most important part was to say, I want to make sure that we vote on something that the Senate is going to agree on before we take a vote on the House side. And as you know, House leadership agreed to that.
How do you feel, and I know we talked about the pay-fors and the details will matter greatly. I get all of that. But sort of, I guess, just big picture, philosophically, your level of comfort, your political outlook on this notion of raising taxes on the higher end, corporations, maybe corporate tax rates in the higher end of income earners. Is that a sincere way to pay for some of these investments in education and healthcare and climate initiatives?
Look, a couple points. Number one, we want to make sure everybody pays their fair share. Number one. Number two, I want to make sure that if you talk about American businesses, that we're not put in a situation that will be competitively at a disadvantage with our competitors outside the United States. So, there are certain things that I'm going to be looking at very carefully. And I will certainly make certain points known to our leadership as to what we need to do. I mean, of course, everybody needs to pay their fair share, but just to raise taxes, I don't want to do that. I've always supported lower taxes. I want to see lower taxes to make sure that productivity of the United States continues to grow. And at the same time, making sure that our businesses are not put at a competitive disadvantage with our competitors across the world.
Let me finish with this, and this sort of gets to the events of the last week and your group's conversations with Speaker Pelosi. What's been your assessment of her performance sort of navigating these two major pieces of legislation in both infrastructure and the reconciliation?
Look, whatever you want to say about Pelosi, she is extremely good at the legislative process. I've been part of her leadership group, so I know how she moves forward, and she has a very difficult job because within the Democratic caucus, she's got to deal with very progressive individuals. But at the same time, she wants to make sure that if she puts something on the floor, that it passes. So she's got to balance that with the moderates. So think about this. You got to deal with, most of the members in the Democratic caucus are progressive. Moderates or conservatives. There's a smaller amount, as you very well know. So she has to find that balance, and I've seen her in the past, and I saw her this week find that balance so we can get it done. We'll
see what happens. I know it's going to be a busy September for you guys, and we'll continue to follow these debates and have these conversations. Congressman Cuellar, very much appreciate your time. Have a great weekend.
You have a great weekend, too.
That will do it this week for the Fox News Rundown from Washington. Next week, the U.S. withdrawal in Afghanistan and the massive military-led evacuation is set to end, capping a 20-year operation and ending America's longest war. We will have plenty on that, what's next, and the emerging and continuing terror threats in the region. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in touch with those you care about. For our team at Fox News Radio, thank you for listening. I'm Jared Halpern from Washington.
Listen to be part of the conversation with me, Brian Kilmeade. I'll talk about the biggest stories of the day and get your take along with some of the biggest newsmakers around. Listen live on the Fox News app or get the podcast at briankilmeadshow.com.